Hi everyone, this is lecture 4 of POS 201, Introduction to Political Theory. Today we talk about the second half of the Republic. This is primarily the section of the Republic in which they've laid out a conception of justice both at the level of the city and at the level of the individual. And today is when they start to talk about how we would actually institute this. So we have the social organization of the just society, but how do we start to create that in terms of institutions, and how do we also ensure that we have a society in which the most just individuals are going to be the ones ruling, as opposed to corrupt leaders that are out for their own self-interest, and they'll actually undermine the cause of justice. So this is a really important section of the Republic. It's a little bit more applied, it's a little bit more practical. If you think back on the first few books of the Republic, it's very, I don't know, we talk about the Socratic method and how it's this method of, kind of philosophically bouncing ideas back and forth and pursuing ideas that ultimately end up being deficient, but you explore the implications of those ideas. But this is much more practical and applied, and it's kind of laying out a blueprint what we would actually do if we wanted to create the just city. So what we'll go through today, first we'll talk about how we institute the social organization of the perfectly just society, and I'll review a little bit the social hierarchy that we laid out last time. I'll kind of go over that again, because the way that they presented in the first few books is actually, it might seem backwards to you. They kind of start out at the level of the city and then move to the individual, so we'll look at it in a different light. And then we talk about the allegory of the cave, which is a metaphor that is introduced in the Republic and is actually really important. It's probably one of the most influential, important metaphors that's introduced in all of Western philosophy. You encounter it quite a bit, and so we'll talk about that a little bit. And then we'll just kind of wrap up with the final word on justice from the Republic. You have this kind of restatement of certain ideas about justice in this excerpt that we have in Book 9, and also how to think about the Republic in relation to our political lives, right? How do we actually make use of these ideas? So just to return to what we were talking about last time, I want to kind of present this in a different way than it's presented in the Republic. If you remember, in the Republic, the first few books of the Republic, they talk about justice first at the level of the city and how the city is comprised, and then they eventually work it down to the level of the individual. But I want to kind of go at it backwards. So if we start at the level of the individual soul, remember, this is all review, that we have these three dimensions of the human soul. You have logos, which is rationality, the part of the soul which reasons, engages in the search for truth, the search for wisdom. You have eros, which is appetite, as the part of the soul which hungers or thirsts, it seeks pleasure, it seeks indulgences, it fulfills desires. And then you have thumos, which is this spirited part of the soul. Okay, and Socrates links that to the idea of the individual being just. A just individual has kind of a balance between these three different dimensions of their soul, of their being, right? So the composition of the soul, if you have one portion of your soul that's dominant, if your thumos is dominant and your eros is dominant, then you are potentially going to be an unjust individual. That aspect of your soul is going to completely dominate all the others, and you want to ideally at that point try and get back to that balance. If you realize that there's an imbalance in your soul, you want to remedy that in some way. Okay, so we can think about the implications of what that would mean if you had one section of your soul dominating the other sections of your soul, what that would mean for you as an individual. Logos, if rationality was completely dominating your soul, maybe you'd be quiet, inwardly focused. You'd lack the drive to actually engage in action. You'd face, you wouldn't be able to face new challenges with courage, right? You wouldn't have any thumos. Furthermore, without eros, you lack the desire for sensual pleasures. You'd be unable to enjoy food, sex, wine, art, music, poetry, all these other aspects of living. So, we could kind of go through all of those. Eros, if we became completely wrapped up in pleasing our senses, there's the risk that we'd behave irrationally, we'd have no logos, and we'd be unmotivated to do anything but fulfill our personal desires. We couldn't engage in sacrifice without thumos. And with thumos, we'd risk becoming spirited and fired up about things that are sort of irrelevant, right? So anyone acting rationally would say to the person with the thumotic soul, let it go. It's not worth it. Why are you so worked up about this? But you wouldn't have logos to realize that you're kind of imbalanced there, right? And without eros, we could enjoy the things in life that are more subdued, which don't potentially work us up into a frenzy. So there's this very important idea of balance, right? Balance in the individual soul. If we extend that up to kind of the next level, the composition of society, Socrates says that there are these different roles which are to be played: the rulers, the guardians, the auxiliaries, right? And then the workmen. And the idea, again, is that in order to play these roles, then a certain section of your soul is going to have to be particularly well refined. So for the rulers, logos has to be particularly well refined. For the guardians, the soldiers, the auxiliaries, thumos has to be particularly well defined. And for the artisans, the craftsmen, the workmen, their eros needs to be particularly well defined, right? So we extend that up even to the role that one plays within society. And then lastly, there's the lie, the myth, which gets people to buy in to the system of social hierarchy. And talked about the idea of the noble lie, or the myth of the metals. So for logos, we're going to tell those individuals who are fit to be rulers that they have gold mixed within their soul, right? For thumos, we're going to tell those individuals that they have silver mixed within their soul. And then for that large class of workmen down at the bottom of the social hierarchy, we're going to say that they have bronze or iron mixed within their soul. And that's going to be the basis upon which they accept what is ultimately a hierarchical and unequal system of social organization. Okay. So that is primarily review from last time. We talked about all of that, but as I said, the way that they present it in the first few books of the Republic is out of order. They start at the level of the city, and then they build it down to the level of the individual. And here we've kind of gone in the opposite order. All right. So after that discussion of what would need to be the balance of the individual soul and the balance of society that you would need to have in order to have a just society, these next few books of the Republic start to lay out in terms of institutions and how society would organize itself, what would need to take place in order to have this balance, both at the level of the individual and at the level of society, right? So we can think of this next chunk of the Republic as really the application of these ideas. If you thought about political theory more generally, maybe we have an ideal conception of what democracy would look like, or an ideal conception of what it means to be a citizen, right? And we lay out that ideal, we lay out what the ideal democracy should be, the ideal citizen should be, but at a certain point, we have to start thinking about, okay, well, yeah, that's a nice ideal, that's a nice set of principles, but how do we actually go about creating that within society, right? What institutions would we need to have in place? What features and kind of settings would need to exist in order for that to take root. And that's really the application stage. So think of our Constitution, for example. That is deeply influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, political theory of folks like John Locke, for example, or Montesquieu, ideas of separation of power, checks and balances, the importance of the individual and individual rights. But those are just abstract ideas. Those are just principles. So our Constitution is where we take those ideas and kind of put them into practice. And it's a lot more applied, it's a lot more focused, it's a lot more practical in its orientation. And this next chunk of the Republic is really that. It's an attempt to take this abstract conception of the soul and society and talk about how we would put it into practice. So that is what Socrates is attempting to do here. And he lays this out in a series of what he calls waves. Essentially, he recognizes that the construction of society that they have currently in Athens does not support this balance, right? And so what he's really talking about is a broad-based system of social and political reform that would need to occur. And he lays it out in this, I think there's kind of 3 waves that he lays out. And he does this in this next set of books in the Republic. So what are the different waves here? Well, the first wave, the first thing that he talks about is the role of women in a perfectly just society. So as we said, I think we mentioned this last time, and we mentioned this to a certain extent when we talked about the defense of Socrates and how the jury system and the political system was comprised. But women are not considered equals in Athenian society. It's for its time, it's a pretty remarkable society in that there is a democracy. People are allowed to vote. People are allowed to have a direct say in the political decisions and the judicial decisions that emerge in their society. But it's a highly unequal society in a lot of respects as well. It's a slave-holding society. There's an entire class of slaves that are deprived of political rights. And women are also largely relegated to the home. They're not making public decisions. They're not engaging in democracy. And they're not viewed as having those rights. They're not viewed really as having those capabilities. Women are viewed as these substandard creatures who can't reason and engage in public debate and public decision making in the same way that men can. And that's the question that they begin to take up at the outset of Book V. And this is the first very controversial assertion that Socrates makes with regard to how you begin to set up and institutionalize this society. So at the outset of Book V, Socrates says ultimately that women ought to share in the instruction, the education, and the performance of societal roles alongside men. So essentially, these different roles within society that we've just laid out in review and that we laid out last time, the idea that there are rulers, that there are guardians, auxiliaries, craftsmen, workmen, right? Women are equally capable of performing all of those social roles and ought to be included in the perfectly just society in a way that currently, right, within Athenian society at that time, they're not. They're not included, and they're not considered to actually be capable of doing that. So that's a really controversial assertion. that's a controversial assertion right up into the 20th century. I mean, if you look at the political history of women throughout time, women didn't receive the right to vote in the United States until 1920. Some European countries, they didn't receive the right to vote until after World War II. In certain regions of Switzerland, which we think of as a pretty progressive, pretty forward-thinking society, women actually didn't receive the right to vote until the 1970s. If you move beyond the Western context, you start to talk about places like the Middle East or North Africa. Women are still fighting for the right to vote and the same individual political rights as men. Women, for example, in Saudi Arabia, were only granted the right to vote in certain municipal elections as recently as last year or a few years ago at this point. So so that's this is an ongoing struggle. And here is Socrates a couple thousand years ago saying, no, women are perfectly capable of performing those roles, and they ought to be included in society in a way that we currently don't include them. So obviously that's going to meet with some not necessarily opposition, but the Socrates' friends, the people he's talking with, are going to kind of question that, because it's such an unconventional, new conception of what women ought to be doing. So Glaucon says, well, wait a minute, Socrates, don't women and men have a different nature, right? We just talked about the importance of how one's place in society ought to be based on one's nature. And so surely if we buy into the idea that there are these different natures within society, then men and women must be different, right? They must have a different nature. So are we really okay saying that there ought to be formal equality in terms of who performs these roles? And are we really okay saying that potentially a woman could play the role of the ruler, or play the role of a soldier or auxiliary or guardian, right? And Socrates replies to that, and he says, no, men and women don't have a different nature. He says there's no occupation that is inherently supposed to be performed by one sex or another. Right? He says none of the occupations concerned with ordering a city belong to woman as woman, nor yet to man as man. But natural gifts are to be found here and there, in both sexes alike, and so far as her nature is concerned, the woman is admissible to all pursuits as well as the man, though in all of them woman is weaker than the man. Right? So what he's saying there is that the differences between men and women are not differences of nature. They aren't fundamentally different beings, right? They're differences of strength. They're differences in the physical composition of our bodies, but not what we are capable of doing, as an occupation or as a pursuit within society. So we don't say that there are, at least according to Socrates, we shouldn't say that there are entire occupations that are not in a woman's nature, but rather we have to reach some sort of arrangement where women can participate in these occupations, but not necessarily perform exactly the same role as men if their physical makeup prevents them from doing so. So to think of an example, I don't know, we could think about a marathon, for example, and think about this in our contemporary society. We wouldn't say, or I think very, very few people in our contemporary society would say that it is against women's nature to run marathons. We wouldn't say that, yeah, women shouldn't really be doing that, because that's not what women should do. That's something that's the domain of men. It's competitive. It's physically exhausting, and that's not really what women ought to be doing. We pretty much accept that women are perfectly capable of doing this, right? There's nothing in their nature that precludes it. There's nothing that prevents a woman from performing that role. But we do accept the idea that men and women are different physically, right? And so it would be completely unfair if we were to have a single race and expect women to compete against men and perform at the same level as men. So both take part in that social role of the marathon runner, but they do it under different expectations with regard to how they perform it. Women are physically weaker, and so they engage in the lighter aspects of the occupation, according to Socrates, right? And in the same way, if we were to think about our marathon, men and women run different races. There's the men's winner and the women's winner, okay? On this basis, so if men and women are going to perform the same roles within society, what that means in terms of education is you have to educate them in the same way, right? So if men and women are going to both be guardians, both be rulers, both be craftsmen, all of those different social roles that we talk about, you have to give them the training and the education so that they can do that and they can succeed in that social role. So that means that women are going to have to be educated right alongside men, and they're going to need to have those same opportunities to refine their soul that men would have. So that's, again, is a very, very progressive idea for the time. That is not the thinking that that predominated within Athenian society. Women, it wasn't viewed as worthwhile to educate women because they were viewed in a lot of ways, not only physically, but mentally and intellectually, to be inferior to men. So that idea of coeducation, that both men and women are going to be educated alongside one another, that's an incredibly forward-thinking and radical idea for its time, right? There's also, one of the reasons why Socrates, his friends look at him kind of strange when he suggests this, is that physical education in Athenian society, some of you may know this, but the gymnasium, right, where folks would be educated and they would engage in physical education and sports and athletics. Those contests, those competitions, that training occurred naked. That was, only men would do that, but they would strip down and they would be naked in order to do so. So when Socrates is suggesting that they invite women into this setting, then the whole idea of men and women being naked alongside each other, engaging in physical education, they find it even more preposterous, right? But this is the argument he lays out, and it's an incredibly progressive, incredibly forward-thinking idea for its time. He's actually kind of a couple thousand years ahead of the curve in terms of the role that women ought to play within a truly just society, within the city and speech that they're creating. Okay, but he's not done yet. So we have this very progressive aspect of Socrates. He's supporting the full integration of women into education and pretty much every aspect of society, but he's doing so a couple thousand years ago. But then he moves on to the second wave of his controversial argument. He says, well, if we truly want to produce the best citizens, at least among those really powerful classes, the guardian and ruling classes, then we have to ensure that we're producing people who are brave and courageous and intelligent and skilled, and we don't want the lazy, we don't want the wasteful, we don't want the gluttonous, we don't want the stupid, right? We don't want those people to be in positions of power within society. Otherwise, we really can't hope to have a just society. And he starts talking about the family structure. And he says essentially what we're going to have to do, at least within those groups, at least within the two top tiers within society, is replace the traditional family structure, which largely looks like our traditional family structure, a father and a mother and children, right, and kind of the nuclear family unit, is we're going to need to replace that with a structure in which essentially the state is going to be one's family, right? So, okay, all right, how are we going to do that? And here's where we start to get into some of the aspects with the argument that Socrates lays out in the Republic that people find really troubling, really disconcerting. Okay, so essentially, Socrates makes a series of modest proposals here, although as we go through them, you'll realize that they aren't overly modest. These are sweeping changes, right? We understand maybe now why it's so important that they not have this conversation in public, because the things that they're talking about not only go against the social norms and conceptions that dominate Athenian society, but I think most of us would look at these even in contemporary society and say, yeah, that sounds like something I would not want, right? But here are some of his modest proposals. The family structure, for Socrates, he views it as this source of faction and this source of potentially discontent within society. So it's going to be really problematic to have a society in which everyone is obedient to the state and pursues justice in the way that he's laid out if we're broken up into these family units where potentially our loyalty to our family would compete against our loyalty to the state. Right? So what we need to do is increase the extent to which people identify with their family. Increase the extent to which people identify with the state, and minimize the extent to which people identify with the traditional conception of the family. So how do we do that? Well, he argues that what would need to happen is that women would be the common wives of the men of society. So what does that mean? It means that no one's going to have a wife of their own, right? So marriage might exist in some form, but not our traditional notion of this lifelong monogamous bond. Women are potentially going to be having sex with and procreating with numerous partners, right? And not a single husband, and not in the traditional way that we think about marriage. He also says that procreation and sex are going to need to be regulated by the state. He says that the best of both sexes should be brought together as often as possible, and the worst of both sexes as seldom as possible, meaning that the best and brightest of your society should be having lots of children, because they're going to produce the best children, the most capable children, the smartest children, the hardest working children, right? Whereas the lazy, the indigent, those that contribute nothing to society, well, we don't want them to have lots of kids, because they're going to produce kids that are probably going to be a lot like they are, right? This is kind of like the idea of eugenics, the notion that there are certain groups, certain races, certain social categories that we want to see procreate, and so we ensure that those groups procreate and other groups don't procreate. I mean, this is essentially what he's talking about. That's a really controversial idea, right? That we tend to be uneasy with the state getting involved with who we choose to partner up with and have kids with. We tend to be uneasy with the state involving itself in human relationships and loving relationships, and so that idea is a really controversial one. And Socrates recognizes that, right? He recognizes this is going to be a hard sell. People aren't going to just accept the idea that they can't partner up and have children with whoever they want to have children with. So he says we're going to basically need to engage in a fair amount of deception in order to accomplish this. He says, it is probable that our rulers will be compelled to have recourse to a good deal of falsehood and deceit for the benefit of their subjects. And if you recollect, we said that all such practices were useful in the character of medicine, right? So he views this kind of in the same way that the doctor gives advice about someone's health, right? The doctor has a certain expertise in what you should be doing with your body, and so they're going to tell you, what you need to do, and you kind of defer to their expertise. So, if a doctor tells you that you're eating all this bad food, and what you really need to do is you need to follow the food pyramid and ensure that you're getting the vitamins and nutrients you need, and you're not just loading up on unhealthy, greasy, salty, fatty foods, then you accept that, right? You kind of say, all right, yeah, no, you're right, I should eat better. And Socrates views procreation and sex and childbearing in the same way. That's a realm in which the state knows best who ought to be having children. And we can deceive people, even if they don't understand what's in their best interest. We can deceive them into doing what's in their best interest. So practically what he suggests is there's going to be these festivals in which we bring people together, and we're going to try to ensure that the people that we bring together are the best people who ought to be having the most children. And so that's how we're going to encourage them to get together and have sex and procreate and produce these great children who will go on to be great citizens and just citizens. And there's a negative side to this as well. I mean, it goes beyond simply encouragement and trying to get the best people in your society to have plenty of children, but he also says that unauthorized children are going to be taken and abandoned. So say that there's people who don't have the best qualities. They aren't likely to produce great children. Well, if they kind of get together and start having lots of children and essentially polluting this pool of citizens that you have, and they're having lots of unauthorized children, then those children are going to be taken to the edges of society and they're going to be abandoned, because you simply don't want all of those stupid, lazy, indigent children polluting the composition of your society as a whole. Again, a really controversial idea, an idea that lots of us might have some problems with. He also says that the children of the best citizens are going to be taken away from their parents at birth, and there's going to be these general nurseries that are kind of collectively run. So these children, they won't grow up knowing their mother and their father, but they're going to be raised in the general nursery under the care of nurses, not their biological parents. And the imperfect children born to inferior parents will be concealed in a mysterious and unknown hiding place, or simply abandoned, right? Left to wilderness, they probably will not survive. So the children of the best citizens are going to be taken at birth. They're going to be raised within the city itself. The children of the less great citizens are going to be taken away and probably abandoned. They'll probably die, right? Or at the very least, they're not going to grow up within Athenian society. And this raises certain practical issues. right? If children don't know who their parents are, and you have this kind of cloistered little group of the best citizens, and they're encouraged to procreate as much as possible, um, then you run into the possibility of incest, right? You run into the possibility of children who don't know that their brother and sister growing up and getting together and having children, and they're actually brother and sister. But Socrates he thinks about that possibility and says, no, well, we have the way that we would encourage procreation. There would be these festivals, and we could actually structure these festivals in such a way that we guard against that. If certain people born in certain months, if we were to kind of stagger the festivals in such a way that they weren't brought together, then we could ensure that there was no incest. So usually when I present this in the classroom, that's one of the questions that arises. Students ask very astutely, well, how would you know that this great person that you're shacking up with was not in fact your brother or your sister? But Socrates thinks about that, and he actually has a pretty good way of guarding against that, guarding against the possibility of incest. So rulers are going to do their best to know the best kind of proper number of which classes need to be born in order to sustain society, and they're going to keep the amount of children raised within that number. There's going to be a pretty rigorous system of population control. You're going to know how many artisans and craftsmen you need. You're going to know how many auxiliaries you need. You need to know what the composition of those individuals who could potentially become rulers of the society, how many of those people you need, and you're going to structure procreation and population around what you need in terms of those numbers. So this is a really controversial assertion by Socrates. It's kind of weird to juxtapose his thinking on gender and gender relations, which is so progressive, with these ideas that, in contemporary politics and contemporary political history, we would associate these ideas with really controversial practices. In the 20th century in the United States, we used to forcibly sterilize people that had certain mental disorders. That's a really dark chapter in American history. If you look at Nazism was an attempt to create a master race, and there were certain races, certain ethnicities, certain social groups, homosexuals, gypsies, Jews, racial minorities, religious minorities. They were viewed as more inferior groups, and so we either wanted to relegate them to the margins of society or eliminate them altogether, exterminate them. These ideas kind of sound like those ideas. Now, admittedly, they're not based on racial classification. They're not based on who you are as an identity. They're based on certain qualities that you have, and selecting on the basis of those qualities. But still, it's that idea that you are, in certain senses, genetically determined to be a good quality, just human being that contributes to the society, or to be kind of a lazy, useless human being who contributes nothing to the society. And that's another idea that's kind of ill fit with contemporary American society. We don't like to think in those terms. So this is a really controversial set of proposals that Socrates puts forth. Beyond that, beyond simply procreation, and beyond simply what individuals are going to be born into the society and raised within the society, he also talks a lot about the life of these two upper classes, the guardians or auxiliaries, and the rulers. And his real concern is they need to have kind of a sense of commonality with one another. These are going to be the smartest, most advantaged, best people within society. And his there's a real fear of factions and power struggles developing within that group. And so Socrates wants to construct their life in such a way that those power struggles, those factions, that factionalization won't develop. And he says in order to do that, they have to really kind of view each other as one big family. So how does that, how do you institutionalize that? Well, one, there's going to be no private property. Obviously, this was true in Athenian society. It's true today. But one of the biggest ways in which factions develop is that there's competition over resources. And he says, well, you eliminate that from the outset. There's no private property. Basically, anything that these individuals need will be provided by the state, right? So, their education, their healthcare, their food, their shelter, all of those things, the state is going to provide for them so that they don't start to acquire wealth and property, and so that factions and competition and conflict don't develop there, right? He's less concerned about the craftsmen and the artisans. They will probably need to have some form of private property. It's hard to imagine a merchant. It's hard to imagine a farmer not having any private property. There would have to be at least some minimal private property. But again, those individuals are viewed as kind of a lesser class of people. So that might be okay, right? It's probably okay if they have some degree of private property because they're not as capable to actually undermine society and to, kind of take over society or to develop these fights and this factionalization that will rip apart the state. These two top classes are also going to have to live in common dwellings together. Think of your college dorm, right? That's essentially what we'd be talking about is dormitory style living. They're going to dine in mess halls together. There's not going to be these individual families. You're not going to dine in your separate home, but you're going to dine in, I don't know, something like a university dining hall. They're going to be educated together. There's a broad-based system of education. Again, the goal is balance of the soul. So there's going to be physical education. There's going to be kind of aesthetic appreciation, music and art. There's going to be things which help them develop their logos, philosophy, mathematics. It's going to be this expansive system of educational training, right? Because they have to be the best and brightest of society. And the key thing is that the existing family structure, at least for these two classes, at least for the guardian and ruling classes, no longer exists, right? You no longer have a father and a mother and a home because that is a danger. That introduces the possibility of factions. And so he's wary of the dangers which family and kinship can introduce. He desperately wants unity, at least among the most powerful individuals within society, and he feels that this system of living together, of not having any private property, of being educated together, of not knowing who your mother and father really are, those are that's the method by which we achieve this unity that's desperately needed within a just society. Okay. So this leads them to the plausibility of this scenario. And if we face it, if we actually look at this issue, what they're proposing is virtually impossible. It was impossible in Athenian society. It's impossible today. It may be more impossible today. If you were to suggest, I don't know, controlling who people can procreate with and have sex with, if you were to suggest or getting rid of the family structure and replacing it with some sort of common living together, people are really going to reject that idea. That's an incredibly controversial idea. And so this leads them to the third wave of Socrates' system of social organization. And Socrates says, yeah, in the society that we have, this is probably impossible, but there is one change by which, as I think we might show, the required revolution would be secured. So he recognizes that it's a revolution, but he recognizes that in order for this system to work, and in order for this system to be implemented in a way that will actually produce the most just society, then there needs to be this one other significant change, and that involves who is going to rule society. And he says ultimately that the philosopher must rule, right? He says, unless it happen either that philosophers acquire the kingly power in cities, or that those who are now called kings and the powers that be imbued with a sufficient measure of genuine philosophy. That is to say, unless political power and philosophy be united in the same person, most of those minds which at present pursue one to the exclusion of the other. So basically, unless philosophical reasoning, the philosophical expertise and intellectual capabilities that someone like Socrates has, and political power become fused, then this entire scenario, one, probably won't be initiated, and two, once it was initiated, probably will not succeed. So, one, it's probably not going to happen. Two, even if it did happen, it probably wouldn't be successful because the person in charge of this whole system of social organization wouldn't be able to implement it in a way that would actually achieve the just city, right? So basically saying in the present unjust society, this mode of organization is impossible. But in a society ruled by a philosopher, people would recognize that this is necessary. They would recognize that this is valuable. They would look at this reorganization of the sexes and the restructuring of the family and the restructuring of education and the change that's going to need to occur within gender relations and gender roles. And they would say, yeah, that's what we need. And the philosopher would be able to make that argument in a compelling way to them, right? The philosopher could justify this to people who would be skeptical and who would be resistant. So this is the idea of the philosopher king, right? Oftentimes when people talk about Socrates, this is what we talk about when we talk about the Republic. The idea of the philosopher king is the idea that political power and reason and rationality, logos, the ability to philosophize, are united in the same person. So Socrates is basically saying, yes, in the present society this is impossible, but in a society ruled by a philosopher it would not be. Okay. So even then, there is some resistance. There are obstacles to the rule of the philosopher, to the philosopher king. Adeimantus objects to this idea. He says, if you take the common conception of philosophy, if you take how everyday people within Athenian society view philosophy and philosophers, they are not, these are not positive conceptions. They don't view them positively. Basically, philosophers within this society, they're viewed either as vicious eccentrics or these depraved dreamers, right? Adeimantus says, those who are inexperienced in the art of dialogue feel that philosophers take advantage of them, when the opposite of what they initially believed is proven true by argument. They feel like the victims of a hustler. Those who make philosophy a career turn out most eccentric and vicious, and others who are more benign end up useless to the city. And Socrates responds to this, and he says, yeah, that's true. Sure, you're right. We see this in the defense, right? We see how Socrates really, for the most part, within Athenian society, he is reviled. the sophists, the poets, those in political power, his citizens generally, they view him as troublesome, they view him as depraved, they view him as corrupting the youth, right? So Socrates experiences this every day. He knows that people in Athenian society don't trust the philosopher and certainly aren't going to want to put him in a position of political power. But he says that is the case. The reason why the philosopher is so reviled is because we live in an unjust society. We live in an imperfect society. The true philosopher is a lover of wisdom. And the philosopher, he is courageous, he is moderate, he is magnificent, he is intelligent, he is endowed with a good memory, all of these wonderful qualities. And so the philosopher is the person who relentlessly pursues the truth. He rejects all of the corruption, all of the imperfections within his society. And the task of the philosopher, the thing that the philosopher has to do, is make society realize that the only just society is the one ruled by the philosopher king, right? So the philosopher, and really Socrates is talking self-referentially here. This is what he views his task to be. The philosopher has to make his society see the light, right? That is his task. So that that kind of takes us up to the end of Book 6. We leave off with Socrates saying that philosophers should rule the perfectly just city. There's some skepticism regarding this. Socrates says, yeah, you're right. The philosophers are viewed as eccentric, they're viewed as vicious, and even the public tends to view them as, at best, kind of useless, right? But ultimately that just means we have work to do. That means that philosophy and philosophers need to convince society of the importance of engaging in the act of philosophy. And that takes us up to the allegory of the cave. And so we're going to talk about the allegory of the cave, and then we kind of wrap up the Republic after exploring the implications of the allegory of the cave, and talk a little bit about how to think about the allegory of the cave and the Republic as a whole. But the allegory of the cave, this is presented in Book 7 of the Republic, and the allegory of the cave is probably one of the most famous metaphors, allusions, allegories that occurs in Western philosophy. Socrates is describing a hypothetical, right? And the purpose of the allegory of the cave is really to draw out the implications of this metaphor for thinking about society and eventually for thinking about justice. But the allegory of the cave turns up in all sorts of other places. The video clip that you have for today is actually a clip from a documentary about philosophy and the movie The Matrix. And The Matrix is a perfect example, right? The Matrix is really a kind of contemporary version, a more technologically sophisticated version of the allegory of the cave. And there's references to this everywhere, right? There's all sorts of references to the allegory of the cave. Probably the most significant, most influential idea that emerges out of the Republic. So when I teach this course in the classroom, I do different things with the allegory of the cave. Sometimes I try and draw the allegory of the cave myself on the board, which is kind of hilarious because I'm not a very good artist. Sometimes I have the students themselves draw the allegory of the cave, which is interesting, and oftentimes students are artistically inclined and can actually do a fairly good representation of the allegory of the cave. But for the purposes of this class, I just have this image of the allegory of the cave, which I think is pretty good. And some of these things will become clearer as we go through the Matrix. When you watch the video clip on the Matrix, I think that does a pretty good job of clarifying what the allegory of the cave is and what it's supposed to represent as well. So the allegory of the cave, this is the picture that Socrates was trying to present in Book VII. We have this cave, right? There are prisoners in the cave. They're chained. You can see the prisoners on the left-hand side of the screen in the picture. And they're unable to move their necks as well. So they're chained, their legs are chained, their arms are chained. They're unable to move their necks, so they can't turn to their side, they can't turn behind them. All they can see are the images that are directly in front of them. And behind them there's a fire that's at the very back of the cave. And there's a roadway as well. And so the fire and the roadway, those are going to project certain images, right? The fire at the very back of the cave, anything that passes on the roadway will be projected to them as a shadowy image on the wall, right? So we could imagine, an animal passes on the roadway, a horse passes on the roadway, and their shadow is going to be projected on the wall in front of the prisoners as a shadow. And they'll hear the sounds of the things that pass them on the roadway, right? But they'll hear them in kind of an echoey fashion because they're in a cave. So they're not going to hear, the direct sounds. They'll hear echoes, and they'll hear kind of unclear versions of the things that are passing. And all they will ultimately see, as long as they are locked in that position, as long as they're chained in the bottom of the cave, are shadows. They're not going to see the actual things in themselves that are passing on the roadway behind them. They're just going to see the shadows in front of them. They're only going to hear echoes of the things that are far away from them. But because that's all they know, because that is all that they can experience through their senses, through their vision, through their auditory senses, then those things that they see, the echoes that they hear, the shadows that they hear, those are going to be taken as real sounds, as real images, right? So it's kind of this strange image, right? There is a path out. There is a path that ascends upwards towards the world outside, and there's some diffused daylight that's coming in, right? So there is a light which is behind them, and there is a pathway out of the cave that leads them up into the actual world, right? Actual sunlight, actual light, actual things. So if they were unchained, we could imagine them traveling upwards out of the cave. So it's kind of a bizarre image. And let's think a little bit about what these different things are supposed to represent, particularly the prisoners and the shadows. So who are the prisoners? Well, in the context of the Republic, a book which is fundamentally about justice and the search for justice, those who reside within the cave are meant to be those who reside within an unjust society, right? They have certain conceptions of what they think justice is, what they think, the proper form of government is. But because they've never known anything else, and because they haven't engaged in the philosophical pursuit for the ideal form of justice, then really all they know are shadows. All they know are echoes of a just society, but they've never actually seen the thing, right? They've never actually gone out and sought the just society. And what are the shadows? Well, the shadows are our muddled notions of what we think truly exists. We think we see something. We think we know something, but we don't. As long as we live in a society in which the task of the philosopher and the pursuit of justice is not respected, right? So we only have these vague, incomplete, shadowy notions of how certain things ought to be, how certain things ought to be constructed. Things like justice, things like goodness, the proper composition of society. We don't have complete understanding, and that the allegory of the cave, um, most of the individuals in Athenian society, I think Socrates would say, are like those prisoners on the floor of the cave. They're like those people who are locked, chained to the floor, and only see shadowy images in front of them. Now, Socrates says, imagine that one of those prisoners was set free from his or her bondage, and they took the path up to the sunlight, right? They were to travel up to the sunlight. And that, remember, that's the world of truth. That's the world of light. That's the world of the actual forms of things, not shadows, not echoes. What would happen? Well, we kind of know what would happen, right? If you've ever been inside a building all day, right, and it's the winter time in Maine, and you are inside, it's kind of shadowy inside, you don't have the lights on, and then you walk outside and there's snow on the ground, and the sun is high up in the sky, and it's shining. Initially you're blinded, right? Your eyes can't adjust, you can't see what's in front of you. You're squinting, you're trying to limit your visual intake of all that light because it's just too much for you. It's painful, right? And Socrates says it would kind of be similar if you were to leave the cave. I mean, it would be worse. It would be far worse. If all you'd ever known was the shadowy existence of living in a cave, to walk out into that sunlight for the first time would be absolutely horrifying, right? You wouldn't be able to see or understand anything. Initially you'd just be blinded, right? And there would be this bright, intense light of the outside world, and it would almost be too much for you to bear. And even as your eyes became adjusted to that light, you'd start to see things that just wouldn't make sense to you, right? You've been in a cave your entire life, and you don't know what the sun is. You don't know what the actual forms of things are. So this world that surrounds you would not make any sense. And he says initially, right, you would really want to return back to the cave. That's what you'd known, right? That is your existence. That is the world in which you lived. And so you wouldn't want to stay up there in the light as it was confronting you. So yeah, it would be a destabilizing, confusing, painful experience. But he says if you were compelled to stay up there, eventually you'd start to see things. Eventually you would kind of adjust to the world around you. Your eyes would adjust, your ears would adjust, and you'd be able to see these things, and you'd start to interpret them. So you'd see sunlit clouds, meadows, streams of the world outside the cave, and you'd slowly begin to have this realization that, yeah, okay, this is what's real. This is what's true. And all that stuff that I've been seeing down in the cave, projected against the wall, well, that is imperfect and shadowy conceptions of what truly is, right? What truly exists in the world. What would happen then if that individual who had been up in the world, the real world, I mean the world of things as they truly exist, what would happen if they returned to the cave? This individual has been freed. He's seen things. She's seen things as they actually exist. And now you can go back down into the cave and you can tell these people that are sitting there locked with their head facing forward, staring at the shadows and hearing the echoes around them, what actually exists up in the world. How would that person be received when they return to the cave? Well, we know how they'd be received, right? They'd be laughed at. They would be ridiculed. They'd be scorned. They'd return to those people and they'd say, look, I've seen something you can't see. everything that you have ever known, everything that I ever knew was false, incomplete, until I went up into the world and actually experienced things as they truly are. Right? We can, I don't know, I mean, if you think of people that kind of approximate this within our own society, think of conspiracy theorists, think of cults, think of extreme pseudo-religious figures who say, yeah, you know, I understand something fundamental that no one else understands, and I'm going to present it to you, and it's going to change your life. It's going to change everything about how you've lived your life up until this point. Generally, those people we reject, right? We reject them because they undermine everything that we've believed. If we actually accept the idea that, I don't know, whatever it might be, that this one individual on a street corner in Boston is the second coming of Jesus, right? And he's going to lead us into salvation, right? Well, that undermines kind of fundamental assumptions about we have about religion and our own lives and the Bible and Christianity, right? And we reject those people as either useless to us, either, you know, they just aren't making any sense and they're not helpful to us, or ultimately, if they are forceful enough in their presentation and they begin to develop a following, we start to view them as dangerous. So they're either useless, they're kind of irrelevant, or they're actually a danger to us. They can be vicious. They can be a threat to society as a whole. So they're useless in the sense that if we go back to the cave metaphor, right, that person that returns back down to the cave, they're useless in the sense that when that person presents those ideas of the world outside the cave to the people that still reside in the cave, their ability now to make practical judgments within the cave is basically ruined, right? If you begin to accept the idea that everything that you've ever known is imperfect and is kind of a fabrication, in some senses isn't the true reality, then your ability to make practical judgments within the cave is basically ruined. The person that returns to the cave is also viewed as vicious. They're viewed as dangerous because what they're doing is seriously disrupting the social order. There is an accepted understanding of what is real, what is true, and what it means to possess wisdom and ultimately authority within that structure, right? And the person that returns to the cave is overturning that. They're undermining that accepted conception of what is real, what is true, and what it means to have wisdom. That sounds a lot like, and it's supposed to sound a lot like, the philosopher, right? It's essentially what the philosopher is doing. That's what Socrates is doing. That's why he is so controversial, is because he's taking the accepted realm of knowledge, the accepted realm of truth, the accepted realm of reality, and he's questioning it in a really fundamental way. And not only is he undermining truth and wisdom, or the accepted conceptions of what truth and wisdom are, but he's undermining the whole power structure and political structure that corresponds with that sense of reality and that sense of truth, right? So the plight of the freed prisoner, the plight of the person that manages to escape from the cave and go up and see reality, is very much like the plight of a philosopher within an unjust society. They're seen as useless. They're seen as vicious. Socrates is a perfect example of this. Their authority is rejected. The easiest way to deal with the challenge that someone like Socrates presents is to reject them, is to dismiss them. And to the extent that you can't reject or dismiss them, you kill them. You put them into exile, right? That is ultimately the strategy that Athenian society pursued with Socrates, because he was undermining their conception of knowledge and their conception of authority and the power structure within Athenian society. Because of that, the philosopher knows that that is how they're likely to be received if they return to the cave. The philosopher is likely to be skeptical about returning to the cave. They don't want to endure that. They don't want to endure the hardship that involves attempting to reform society, attempting to alter an unjust society. And the philosopher would really probably be most happy if they were out in the realm of their own ideas, right? If they were kind of in an introspective setting in which they were just kind of pursuing ideas for the sake of pursuing ideas. The biggest threat with regard to logos and with regard to the philosopher is that they'll retreat inward. They retreat inward into the life of the mind and never contribute to society, because they're much more happy reading and thinking and philosophizing on their own, right? So that is the danger of the philosopher, is that they don't return to society and actually try and apply their knowledge. And Socrates understands that temptation, because that is a life of hardship. If you're going to begin to criticize society, begin to criticize the existing philosophies and the existing authority structure. And for that reason, Socrates argues that this idea of the philosopher king, this idea that the person that's going to rule society ought to be a philosopher, that person's going to have to be compelled to rule. We ultimately have to make the philosopher king do this, right? That is the allegory of the cave in a nutshell. I mean, that's what Socrates is driving at there. It gets into Socrates' conception of the proper form of government. This is dealt with a lot more in Book 8, and I don't have you read Book 8 because it's long and it goes through this kind of organic life cycle of the state, and it's I think we can deal with the things that are there pretty quickly, and you already have a lot of reading for this class, so I don't go into this in a great detail, but I think it is important just to briefly run through what Socrates views to be the proper form of government. The first thing it's important to note, Socrates isn't really a democrat, right? He doesn't really have faith in popular rule. Remember, he sets up a social hierarchy, and he says that social hierarchy ought to exist. It's important that we have that social hierarchy and that there be rigid inequalities between who has political power and who doesn't have political power, right? So if we were to say what Socrates' favored form of government is, it's basically an aristocracy, but it's not. When we talk about the aristocracy, we tend to think about the French aristocracy, for example. We tend to think about societies in which the rich rule society, where there's this ruling elite, right? But they rule on the basis of their wealth and their possessions and their acquisitions, and that's not what Socrates is talking about. Socrates does not want a society in which the wealthy rule. In fact, remember we said that Socrates says it's really important that the guardians and the ruling classes don't have material possessions and aren't allowed to acquire individual wealth, because he thinks that will undermine the society, and ultimately that will lead to factions and competition, and you'll have an unjust society on that basis. So he favors an aristocracy, but it's more like an aristocracy based on wisdom. It's an aristocracy in which the people who have the greatest philosophical capabilities, whose ability to search for wisdom and truth, and who tenaciously reject falsehood and error, and are wise in that sense, those people are going to be in charge, right? Those are the people who are going to rule society. Um, and at the head of that entire hierarchy, at the head of that kind of pyramid structure of society, is going to be the philosopher king. And Socrates, he gets into this a lot more in Book 8, but he also views political history as cyclical. So even the best form of government eventually begins to decline and falls apart. So even though he's caught up in creating this ideal city, this ideal state, he recognizes that this government isn't going to last forever. It will eventually degrade, it will decline, and it will fall. And you'll have to work on creating a new form of government that approximates those ideals, right? He has this kind of organic conception of how politics works. A political system is like a plant. You plant the seeds, you nurture the plant, eventually it grows, it flourishes, it buds, it's wonderful, it's beautiful, it's perfect, but eventually it begins to die, and the process starts over again. It withers, it dies, it decomposes, it's born again, right? Socrates in Book 9, just to close out our discussion of the Republic, in the short excerpt in Book 9, Socrates returns to this idea of whether it is better to be just or unjust. They had taken this up in Book 2. This was the core of their debate with Thrasymachus, right? Whether it's better to be just or unjust, and Thrasymachus had really forcefully said it's far better to be unjust. Essentially said nice guys finish last, right? If you attempt to be just, you will always suffer at the hands of those who are unjust and who don't put those restrictions upon themselves. And in that book, they had Socrates' friends had asked him, well, do you want to have convinced us? Do you want to have seemed to convince us, or do you really want to convince us? And they finally get back around to that question in Book 9, and this kind of closes out our discussion of the Republic. But they got into this long argument on whether it was more advantageous to be just and to behave justly or not. And Socrates had argued that by not behaving justly, we undermine collective endeavors, we put ourselves in a state of internal strife. But he hadn't yet laid out the composition of the soul. It wasn't entirely clear what was meant by internal strife. Now that Socrates has laid out his ideas regarding the division of the soul and how society ought to be constructed, he can actually return to this question and make a better argument. And he says that injustice, which he defines as this imbalance of the soul, actually puts you in a form of slavery. You're no longer free. You're no longer an autonomous being when your soul is imbalanced, right? An imbalanced soul is in fact enslaved. And so just laws, adhering to just laws, are designed to free an enslaved soul until such time as they no longer need the law. So until behaving justly becomes so ingrained and so habitual that you no longer even need the law to behave justly. He says, a man whose unbalanced soul escapes detection grows still more vicious than before, whereas if he is found out and punished, that brute part of him is put to sleep and tamed, and the tamed part is liberated, and the whole soul is molded to its best nature, and thus, through the acquisition of temperance and justice combined with wisdom, attains a condition which is more precious than that attained by a body endowed with strength, beauty, and health. Right? So the internal health of the soul is more beautiful than the external health of beauty or strength or health. And laws it sounds almost paradoxically, because we think of laws as restrictions on our action, but Socrates is really saying no. Just laws, truly just laws, actually free us. They liberate us from um, that that enslavement of ourselves that we can engage in when our soul is unbalanced, when there's an imbalance between those different parts of the soul. And that's how they close out the question of justice. And that's how we close out our discussion of the Republic. So the question is how to think about the Republic. What we gain from examining the Republic and examining the Republic in the detail that we do. And really, the value of the Republic is that it gives us lots of interesting things to think about. It certainly doesn't give us a blueprint for how we would want to construct society. I think that the suggestions that are made in the Republic with regard to how we actually set up the institutions of society would never occur within a modern society, would probably never occur within an ancient society like Athens. And many actually argue that wasn't ever the intent. That the purpose of the Republic was never to create a blueprint for the just society. Some people actually argue that the Republic is designed to show the paradox that occurs when we attempt to institutionalize a perfectly just society, that we actually create a dystopia when we set out with that as our applied practical goal. But anyway, obviously there's a lot within this conception that makes us uneasy, that would be hesitant to accept, especially in a modern democratic society. First, there's this notion of naturalized hierarchy. There is a clear hierarchy that exists in nature, and we have to maintain that. Otherwise, that's how we head down the road to injustice. And to the extent that we have to lie to people, we can do that to convince them of this naturalized hierarchy. There's a really limited role for popular participation, and we see a distrust of mass democracy in Socrates, right? His Athenian society was a direct democracy. In many ways, it was more democratic than our own society, but he viewed it as really an archetype of injustice and a corrupt and wicked society. Socrates is more than willing to deceive the masses. We have the myth of the metals, which the entire hierarchy of society is based on a lie that you tell to your public. We have all of the manipulation and lying that occurs with regard to procreation and sex, and who gets to have children with who, right? He recognizes that there's going to have to be plenty of deception that we engage in there to convince people that, yeah, you have to have sex with certain people at certain times, and you can't break out of those restrictions, those regulations with regard to sex and procreation. And then there's just these concrete suggestions with regard to the family, marriage, children, that I think virtually all of us would reject many of those things in some form. Nobody wants to really do away with the family structure. Nobody wants to have their children taken away from them in birth and raised by the state. Those are solutions that in modern society we would reject out of hand, right? But the Republic is incredibly valuable. It's an incredibly valuable piece of political philosophy. And why is that? Well, it forces us to think about the plausibility of an ideally just society. Some argue that the Republic is designed to show us that the search for perfect justice would likely create terrible, terrible injustice. That's one interpretation of the Republic. It begins this systematic exploration of the question of justice. And like I said at the outset, we're still engaged in that search today. We are still probing those questions within political theory. And really, in a broader sense, if going back to the very first lecture that we had on normative questioning, the Republic begins the tradition of normative theorizing about politics, of the thinking about what ought to be. That is front and center within the Republic, and that is what we continue to engage in when we engage in political theory, is this tradition of normative theorizing, right, which is laid out for us in the Republic. So, some people dismiss the ancients, ancient Greece and the works of classical political philosophers in terms of their relevance for contemporary political theory and contemporary political thinking. But I think there's a lot of important stuff going on within the Republic, and it's really important that we pay attention to what is occurring here and think about some of these questions, because these are questions that we've never really fundamentally resolved. And in some ways, it's our responsibility as citizens and as politically engaged and educated actors to continue to think about justice and what justice means and what justice ought to be within any society, right? That's really our fundamental task, and those questions aren't going away. They aren't going away, and they'll never be satisfactorily answered as we continue to think about politics. So just to close out, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, today's video clip is it's actually from a documentary that was done on The Matrix. The Matrix, a couple of years ago, they came out with this box set of it was the first Matrix movie. Matrix Reloaded was on there, and then there was some making of the Matrix things in there. There was something called the Animatrix. It was like 6 DVDs devoted to the Matrix, which as much of a geek as I am, I don't own it, but somebody actually lent it to me. And there is a DVD there that is just philosophy and the Matrix, and it's different philosophers weighing in on some of the different philosophical issues that are raised by the Matrix. The Matrix, even if you watch it for the special effects, or you watched it because it was this neat, kind of sci-fi, mind-bending movie, there are really deep philosophical questions running through the Matrix. And the entire premise of the movie is actually lifted basically straight from the Republic. The Matrix itself is a movie in which supposedly, we have been experiencing a reality, but that reality has been constructed for us by machines, and we are in fact in a form of slavery that we don't even recognize that we're in. And it's a computer-generated world that simulates reality for us, but in reality, we are enslaved. And that's the Allegory of the Cave. I mean, that is a contemporary kind of jazzed up version of the Allegory of the Cave. It's lifted straight from the Republic. So today's video clip involves various philosophers talking about the premise and the plot line of the Matrix in relation to the Allegory of the Cave. It's only about 5 minutes. It's relatively brief. But in watching this, I want you to think about the utility of that metaphor, the Allegory of the Cave, for living in today's world. And crucially, think about it in relation to politics. And what is the lesson that we ought to pull away from the Allegory of the Cave, or in its more contemporary formulation, the Matrix, right? What are the implications of something like the Matrix or the Allegory of the Cave in terms of thinking about contemporary politics and thinking about being an educated, engaged political actor? For next time, we take a giant leap forward in terms of time. We talk about Machiavelli. So previously we were dealing with ancient Athens, which is 300 to 400 BC. Machiavelli is writing in Renaissance era Italy, and so we jump over a lot in terms of time. And we'll talk about that a little bit and what was going on in that interim period. But for next time, read the introduction, which lays out Machiavelli, and The Prince, which is probably Machiavelli's most significant, well-known political work. It's another work that you see referenced virtually everywhere. A lot of people talk about Machiavelli and his suggestions for what one ought to do in politics. And also, in addition to this, there's a really short reading. I think it's only a page, maybe 2 pages. That's in the electronic readings folder on First Class. And this is a letter that Machiavelli actually wrote roughly around the time that he was writing The Prince. It was to a friend of his, Vittori, and Machiavelli was actually in exile at the time he wrote this. He had gotten into trouble with the ruling family in his society, and so he's writing after he's been tortured and kicked out of society. And it's a really interesting letter in which he talks not only about his condition and how it's kind of crappy and he doesn't really enjoy it, but he's also talking about the tradition of political theory. And first thing, I mean, you'll notice a very, very different conception of politics in Machiavelli. Just to run through this really quickly, he's much more based on observation and the realities of politics. So if the tradition of ideal theory and thinking about the ideal form of justice that we encounter within the Republic turned you off a little bit, then Machiavelli is going to be much more conducive to what you're interested in. He's talking about what we have to do and what the harsh realities of political life are. And he's much less focused on the ideal. He's very distrustful of what we call moral perfectionism, the idea that we should attempt to achieve some sort of perfection, either at the level of constructing institutions or at the level of ourselves, right? The idea that we can be perfectly moral human beings is, at least in The Prince, he kind of dismisses. And also, with regard to the letter, think about why we'd read this letter from Machiavelli to a friend of his in a class on political theory. What is the relevance of that letter, and how does that letter help us understand Machiavelli's political thought a little bit better? Okay, so we'll wrap it up there. Like I said, do check out the video clip on the Matrix. It's a really interesting clip. And if you are so inclined, you can comment on it in the discussion board. Remember that you have to do 3 of those posts, 3 quality posts on the discussion board every week. So it's kind of an interesting one to think about. And if you're interested, you can pop over to the discussion board, and I'll have an opening question, but then it's up to you guys what you want to discuss. So I'll leave it there, and we'll pick it up next time with Machiavelli. Thanks.